Sci-fi. I know what you're thinking. Moderately handsome, cisgender white guy, self-proclaimed chosen one, right? He somehow understands oppression well enough to serve as the liaison between humanity and whatever vaguely described non-human threat is plaguing our planet or our species or our way of life. By the end of the story, he probably kisses one of the aliens, becomes the holy exception to anti-human discrimination we've been looking for the whole series, and the aliens' faith in humanity is restored. Hooray. Now, as we see in a few, more than a few, sci-fi stories, alien beings tend to act as a stand-in for non-white people. Human beings find them, learn about them, save them, teach them our language, teach them our religion, teach them our morals. It's a metaphor, after all, a metaphor so obvious and undemanding that it's been recycled over and over and over again. At the other end of the sci-fi spectrum are the stories about human victims. Imagine if aliens enslaved humans. What if cyborgs began controlling our language and our culture? Picture a world where humans were forced to endlessly contribute to a powerful group who didn't have their best interest in mind and ultimately worked to uphold the very system that kept them from liberation? AKA, what if this thing that powerful humans already do to marginalized humans was done by aliens? Oh my god. In the sci-fi stories where we do see people of color represented, especially the more recent ones, there's a pattern of writing that eliminates the need for racialized world building, which in itself is difficult. So for white authors, what's the easy workaround? Make the future post-racial. It's what we strive for, right? A world where anyone can be the hero, regardless of racial identity. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, yellow, purple. Here, none of that matters. Race is non-existent, and we're all just people. You all get what I'm saying. However, in writing BIPOC characters into post-racial futures, we sacrifice something invaluable: representation. If their ethnicity doesn't matter negatively, it doesn't matter positively either. It's like breaking even, and that's where our problem lies. But if you're asking yourself, is representation always the goal? I ask myself the same thing. But inevitably, every story strives for representation. Representation of experience, of thought process, of theory, of theme, of feeling. One way or another, every good story represents something. It's just not always a group of people. Today, we're looking at minority representation, specifically that of racial and ethnic minorities. I decided to lay out some criteria as to what fosters good or effective representation of these groups, in my opinion. First, dynamic characters. Characters from various backgrounds are important to sci-fi stories, but if their ethnicity or their racial identity is the only interesting thing about them, that's not really valuable. Additionally, if their racial or ethnic identity doesn't matter at all, that representation also isn't purposeful. Second is making identities clear, not coded. Making a character coded as a race or ethnicity makes it easy for writers to fall into stereotypes, oftentimes damaging ones. Additionally, the coding of characters often excuses the writer from being held accountable for their representation because it's all implied, when often a character's whiteness or proximity to whiteness is not. Third and finally is intentional racial world building. Readers should have a solid understanding of what matters, what doesn't, and why it matters or not. Racial world building is a crucial piece of world building that's often missing, probably because it's not easy to do. It takes time and consideration to determine how a fictional society might operate in relation to various identities. But it's no less important for authors to research based on our current racial climates, regardless of how the author experiences our world. So today we're asking the big question: does eliminating post-racial societies in sci-fi craft more meaningful representation? Let's begin. Part 1. Identity as a groundwork, not an additive. In 2018, a new movie by Black filmmaker Boots Riley premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The film, called Sorry to Bother You, featured everyone's favorite bi-panic duo Lakeith Stanfield and Tessa Thompson, playing struggle bus passenger Cassius Cash Green and his artist girlfriend Detroit. When Cash gets a job in telemarketing, he learns from a fellow coworker how to use his white voice. It's hilarious, and it catapults him into success with the company.
Spin doctors. Classic. Tim, I want to chop it up more, but I gotta get to my squash game. Was that Visa?
His white voice is actually so good that he gets continually promoted to the upstairs, high-profile office of power callers. It's a metaphor.
Here's the starting salary.
Well, man, I'm gonna have to get me some new suits.
And discovers that all along he's been selling slave labor. It's a metaphor. Now, the sci-fi aspect comes in when, spoiler alert, the exploited workers are essentially forced to take a drug that turns them into equisapiens, these really creepy humanoid horse figure things. And it's a play on the expectation of workers under capitalism to ascribe to workhorse standards of labor and horsepower. They, of course, channel the horse and become stronger, more efficient employees. It's a metaphor. But, unlike many sci-fi stories, Sorry to Bother You features a cast of mostly people of color. Cash is black, as is Detroit, and many of Cash's coworkers who struggle to unionize under the power collars are also people of color. And this is not at all random. Though it would have been easy for the story to ignore race altogether and make the issue about class, it doesn't. The film brilliantly recognizes the connection between the two, and the specific exploitation of black people under capitalism since its beginnings. It utilizes this to craft a protagonist that's informed by all of this trauma, knowledge, and experience. Cash's race isn't convenient or insignificant or random, but rather it builds on the foundation of his character, and similarly explains the motivation of other characters in the film as well. His reaction to the Equisapiens, for example, is immediately, did they do this to me too? Because even though he's one of the most successful power callers, he can equally recognize the realistic threat and devaluation of his status that his blackness plays in that space. Now, Sorry to Bother You is a great example of what sci-fi looks like when our current systems of race transcend into the otherworldly changes in the story. And there are other great examples, which we'll come back to later, but first, it's important to contextualize why the majority of white male sci-fi, or traditional sci-fi, misses that mark. Number 3 on NPR's list of best science fiction fantasy books is Orson Scott Card's acclaimed novel Ender's Game. Set a couple of centuries in the future, the story follows this boy genius Ender Wiggin, essentially a toddler with a target, and he spends ages 5 through 10 training to become the next leading general in our war against our space enemies, the Buggers. He's pulled from his family and brought to a spaceship where he is trained among other young children, boys mostly, and he learns strategy that desensitizes him enough to violence that he one day commits xenocide, basically wiping out the entirety of the Bugger race, who we later find out had no intention of killing sentient life in the first place. But in the next book, things get interesting. Card hits both of the two human-alien tropes, humans in trouble on the defensive in Ender's Game, and humans looking to save on the offensive in Speaker for the Dead, its sequel. We're the colonizers in this one. In Speaker for the Dead, Ender's like 4,000 years into the future, or something, and now he's a moderately handsome cisgender white guy who's a self-proclaimed chosen one. Basically, they find a planet with some aliens that they nickname piggies, and try to learn their culture, and teach our own in the process. It's Ender's anthropological debut, and he basically realizes they have tribal spiritual practices. There's also a side plot where the piggies are converted to Catholicism. Now, I could get into Orson Scott Card's politics to make a point as to why these books do absolutely nothing for people of color, but that would be way too easy. So, instead, I will be using some critical thinking skills to prove that even after separating the art from the artist, this book is really bad for people of color. The other boys that Ender meets on the ship are proof that this society is not post-racial. There's a really small black kid who Ender notes, and that's about it. We can assume based on physical description and interaction with characters of color that Ender's a white child, which later is half confirmed when Card signs off on a graphic novel adaptation where he's drawn with blonde hair and blue eyes. Yikes. In Speaker for the Dead, we see the white savior trope crumble in on itself. As Ender chooses to study and understand the piggy race, Card attempts to frame Ender as the one human who truly understands, with quotes such as, "You're cultural supremacist to the core. You'll perform your questionable activities to help out the poor little piggies, but there isn't a chance in the world you'll notice when they have something to teach you." It sounds great, but that entire concept falls apart when we realize that Ender is learning a lesson that BIPOC individuals have been trying to teach for centuries in our world. Even if, in the best case scenario, people with a white savior complex get it, they did so through a major tool of translation. They learned it from a series of fictional space pigs rather than the people of color on Earth who've been screaming about this for centuries. So why not just write the piggies as people of color, or even yet make the white characters the unfamiliar part of the metaphor. When comparing Card's work to an author of color like Nnedi Okorafor, you could clearly see why world-building racialized societies doesn't have to be limiting. In Okorafor's trilogy Binti, she explores the life of a Himba girl from Southwest Africa who's been chosen to attend what's essentially alien college. Fun, right? On the way there, the rest of the humans from Earth, who are all non-black, are mysteriously killed by these aliens seeking revenge on the university for taking a sacred artifact from their group. Now, Binti is spared by the aliens, but she's left to deal with the remnants of that trauma, her imposter syndrome as the only human from her class who makes it to the university, and more than anything, her intense survivor's guilt for surviving the attack that killed so many of her friends. She travels between space and her home in Africa, finding out where she fits into this interspecies conflict. What makes Binti especially compelling is that the stories don't center our protagonist's blackness, but each of her decisions and experiences are driven in some way by that aspect of her identity. It's a story about othering, but othering not only in the sense of species discrimination. Her humanness makes her the other at the university, but that's not where the metaphor lies. She already understands what it's like to be the other due to her identity on Earth as a black woman from an indigenous tribe. Rather, her lesson learned comes from the embrace of self and nuance of thought process that a lot of white protagonists are just lacking. It makes her strong, it makes her relatable, and it makes sense. This story doesn't chase a metaphor because it doesn't need to. Instead, it introduces a more complex character, a nuanced intercultural communication issue, and a world in which nothing is simple, a testament to the intricacies of our own. Part 2, Recent Sci-Fi and the Embrace of Race. In 2011, a somewhat twisted new series aired on Britain's Channel 4, a sci-fi anthology loosely based on the classic TV thriller The Twilight Zone.
Who, me? Oh, hardly.
This show tackled all kinds of plots: artificial intelligence, technologically advanced crime, sadomasochist doctors. Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror really has it all. Each episode, separate from the last, crafts a narrative about money or science or human connection. Now, the fact that each episode takes place in a different version of our world is important. This has been confirmed by the creators, though we do see Easter eggs of the stories interconnected. Since we start each episode with a clean slate, the types of futures are greatly explored. Some are incredibly close in proximity to our own, like a world where you can give people ratings out of 5 stars based on your interactions. But some are further from our current timeline, like one world where everyone has to fight lethal robot dogs in some sort of post-apocalyptic nightmare. Though, one thing that's really interesting about Black Mirror is that it makes looking at post-racial versus racialized sci-fi easy because the episodes are short and disconnected. In one episode entitled 15 Million Merits, our main character Bing peddles to earn points that he has to spend on necessities like food, soap, and toothpaste. With his spare merits, he skips the force-fed content of this dystopian TV network. He eventually convinces another character, Abby, to go on this talent competition on TV, and when she's tricked into entering the adult film industry, he goes onto the show and breaks down with a piece of glass held to his neck, screaming at the judges about liberation.
Everybody shit! That's not even there. Show us something real and free and beautiful. You could have.
Now, this episode of Black Mirror was angled with a classist divide in mind. One of the rich judges, Judge Wraith, is black, suggesting the division of slave-like peddlers and freed outsiders is based on class rather than racial divide. The society appears post-racial, as Bang has no experiences while he's inside that suggest people are biased against him for being a dark-skinned black man. Most of the discrimination within the institution is pointed at overweight individuals, actually. On the other hand, a different episode of the show entitled Black Museum features a black main character named Nish who stops into this weird museum, exhibiting remnants of horrific science experiments, crimes, and technologies. After Rolo, the white owner, walks her through a few of the stories, they land on the museum's centerpiece, a hologram of Black death penalty recipient Clayton. His consciousness has been projected into the hologram, and the museum goers can pull the lever to give him the electric chair live over and over and over again, with this fancy little souvenir included. It's weird. Funnily, or not so funnily enough, Nish reveals herself to be Clayton's daughter. She details the rest of the story, which includes white supremacists visiting the museum in massive waves to take part in Rolo's sick experiment. As Nish becomes more and more unhinged, Rolo asphyxiates because she poisoned him, and she uses the same technology to project his consciousness into the hologram, punished to feel the pain of the electric chair for eternity. She pulls the lever once, takes her souvenir of Rollo, and burns the museum to the ground in this chilling final sequence. This sci-fi story, compared to 15 Million Merits, is very clearly racialized, and depicts how technological advancements might one day disproportionately harm black individuals. It's a cool take, if you ask me. Black Mirror plays well with both ideas, and honestly plays a lot in the in-between post-racial and racialized. The strange thing is, we aren't always sure if characters' races are important in these stories, especially if the main character is white. But as a viewer of color, watching Black Mirror is like one really long segment of What Would You Do starring John Quinones, because the entire time you're just like, oh yeah, no. They let a doctor put a chip in their child? Yeah, police were abusing that. Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Chris, you gotta get the fuck up out of there, man. You in some eye wide shut situation. Leave, motherfucker.
But if y'all want to get crazy, we can get crazy.
Part 3, where do we go from here? Literally. I'm sure you all know W.B. Du Bois, at least I hope you do, but what you might not know is that he dabbled in sci-fi. He has a story entitled The Comet, set in New York City. To briefly summarize, our main character Jim is this black bank employee who's essentially sent deep underground to this dangerous vault at the beginning of the story to retrieve something for his white boss. He's seen as the only one disposable enough to go down there and be in such a dangerous place. Ouch. While he's underground, a comet passes, killing everyone who breathed in its chemical releases, aka everyone above ground. It's instant karma. And Jim is left wandering the streets of Harlem, looking for another survivor. The only other person he can find is this white woman named Julia, who Jim saves, but unfortunately, as they begin their travel, we realize that she's kind of racist, and she's afraid of Jim, both in her thoughts and in her words. When a group of white men who survived find them, they suggest that Jim has been violent and insinuate that he should be lynched. Julia simply denies it and basically is super embarrassed and relays that he saved her life. Jim gains absolutely nothing until the very end when he miraculously reunites with his wife. The whole thing is super messed up. W.B. Du Bois explores a lot in this story, but one of the things I remain focused on analyzing is how Du Bois represents the lack of vitality and humanness. We might often assume that in a crisis situation or extreme existential doom, humanity trumps all other attributes. Our togetherness matters and is prioritized because we're all human, and all else falls away in a moment of desperation. However, Du Bois challenges that theory, playing with the more realistic idea that our preconceived notions and biases will continue to inform our decisions, even in the face of disaster without unity. Reland Rabaka, in a piece entitled W.B. Du Bois, The Comet and Contributions to Critical Race Theory, an essay on black radical politics and anti-racist social ethics, offers that in some sense, Du Bois can be seen as saying that Western European and white American culture are so thoroughly shot with racism and the thousands of injustices, oppressions, and exclusions that accompany it, that it cannot quickly be unlearned even in a moment of crisis. This same theory is presented in the acclaimed black sci-fi author Octavia Butler's famous sci-fi trilogy Xenogenesis, later renamed Lilith's Brood. In the first novel of the series, Dawn, humans wake up one at a time aboard this alien spacecraft. Lilith, the black woman who awakens first and has been chosen to mother the other humans as they adjust, continually battles distrust, hatred, and disrespect from the other humans as she awakens them. For example, the leader of the anti-Lilith group of humans is a white male police officer named Peter. He constantly pushes the other humans to distrust her, questioning why is she the one who deserves to lead, or whether she's like them. This small group of humans are the only ones known to have survived Earth's war, but remain unwilling to compromise and set the ideals learned on Earth years ago, like racism and misogyny, aside to unite under Lilith as their leader. And they're all stupid because she knows everything, but it makes so much sense why no one listens. Octavia Butler challenges the primary notion of post-racial sci-fi, the idealist perspective that basically in crisis we love, trust, and unite more easily. The question then becomes the balance. We need characters of color in sci-fi, but unless the world we build is post-racial, it can be hard to place them within the context of the story, because we know the reality is that no matter how different the world, some things from ours would probably carry over. Let's revisit the criteria for meaningful representation that we established before. Dynamic characters, clear not coded, and intentional racial world building. If Du Bois and Butler have taught us anything, it's the value of the third. When writing sci-fi, often the goal is to create a world unlike our own. one with different rules, different technology, different planets, or different truths. But for me at least, what makes sci-fi stories compelling is their connections to our current truths. What aspect of our current world does this author believe will transcend time or advancement? What structures remain post-apocalypse or post-invasion? What beliefs or experiences become important in the face of existentialism? So I suppose if we're looking at racialized sci-fi versus post-racial sci-fi, there isn't necessarily a better choice, but more so there's a necessary strategy. And that strategy encompasses our third piece of criteria, addressing how this version of our world came to be. Not just that aliens invaded or that new science became possible, but that our structures and institutions have fundamentally shifted because of X, Y, and Z to create our current world. The point is simple. Where do we go from here? What has happened in this world since today's world? What changes? What stays? What's completely abolished? If that third criteria of racial world building is met, I would argue that the representation of BIPOC characters crafted will be meaningful, because it will take accountability by addressing our experiences in the now, informed by our truthfully brutal histories, but it will also allow for the unlimited exploration of the millions of stories that could be produced from the very same starting point right now.